everyone in Montessori Europe and around the world. We are absolutely delighted to welcome back Andrea Lulka, who had indirectly offered this webinar session when we finished looking at the Montessori Connect discussions about the child, environment, adult, and community. So for many of you, I do not need to introduce Andy. You already know her. You are aware of her wisdom and of her knowledge. And I hand over to Andy. Before you begin, Andy, it is important to remind you that the breakout rooms are for you to consider, reflect, and share your ideas on the key question that Andy will pose at the end of her presentation, because it is really, really important that we work on these ideas together and alone and share them. So really over to you now, Andy. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. And you're so right. And I think it'll come up a lot that observation is not actually the individual thing that we think it is. So the question that I pose is, what does it actually mean to observe? And what I want you to do first is to think about all the ways that you have been taught to observe and what those might look like. In my experience in mainstream as well as in Montessori, there's usually a form to fill out. Yes? Have any of you had to fill out forms for observation? Have you ever had to do checkboxes for observation? Mm-hmm. So that's not the kind of observation I'm going to be talking about today. Not even close. Today, we're going to move away from that kind of observation, which is super important. Okay, and I want to make this really clear. This is not an either or that I'm talking about. This is a both and, because those checkboxes have a really important purpose and those forms have a really important purpose. But what I want to talk to you about is transformative observation as part of the process of the spiritual preparation of the teacher. It's a very different kind of observation. It's all about us. So what I'm going to do today, I hope, is to inspire you. And I'm not going to give you any practical skills. I'm not going to give you a manual. And I'm going to be asking a lot of questions that have no answers. And so to prepare for that, Gwendolyn, if you could pull up that quote, please. Those of you who follow me on Facebook will have seen this last night, because I was writing this out and I was like, this is where I'm going. So be patient towards all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms and like books that are now written in a very foreign tongue. Do not now seek the answers which cannot be given you because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. Thank you, Gwendolyn. That's the relationship that I want to create here with these questions. Okay. Montessori, she talks about observation as something that we need to learn, right? Observation, when she talks about it, and she talks about it from the very, very beginning. In one of her first texts, she says that the main role of the educator is to wait while observing. What does it mean to wait while observing? What are we waiting for? At the beginning, she was also very concerned with those checklist type observations, right? We have an entire book called Pedagogical Anthropology, which is all about measurement. And that's really important because it's thanks to those measurements that she took that we have the child-sized furniture, and that we know how children actually physically develop and how that physical development lines up with their inner development, with their overall holistic development. But then she moved away from that. She stopped measuring children. And she shifts observation to the point that in The Absorbent Mind, one of the last books she wrote, what she's telling us is that observation is a matter of our spirit. It's a matter of our development. And I shared a quote about this in the blog post. So if you haven't read that, go look at it. But what she's telling us is that observation is a thing that we need to learn, and that it is about our spirit and our imagination. It is about looking for the child who is not yet there. That is what waiting while observing means. It means that we are waiting for the child to reveal their secrets, the secret of childhood, right? The discovery of the child. This is how it happens. It happens while waiting, while observing. So observation is all about the guide, and it is about the internal changes that the guide has to make. It is about learning how to do that, how to be still, how to wait. And that is one of the hardest things for us. We come into education because we love children. We come into education because we want to support children. And much of what we are taught about supporting children is that we have to do things for them. And Montessori asks us to do the exact opposite. It asks us to sit back and let them do the doing. It asks us to be passive in a way. And yet, observation is very active. So how do we reconcile those two? How do we reconcile being physically passive, but in every other facet of self, being fully awake and aware, active, and engaged? So those of you who know me know that I come from a line of Montessori educators and advocates. And the line of Montessori training that comes down through Nan Hanrath, who was the lead trainer in Mexico in the 60s and 70s, is very much focused on observation. And one of the stories that sticks with me from my childhood is one that my father tells about how my mother, how he was just in awe of how my mother would be with us, because he wasn't used to this, right? My father was brought up very traditionally, but my mother would just be with us. You know, we would go for a walk, and then my sister and I would want to stop and look, because that's what children do. And he would watch my mother, because she would just sit with us and she would watch us watching the ants crawl across the sidewalk. And so I want you to think about that, and I want you to think about, what does it feel like to be watched? And I want you to think about the different qualities of watching. There are ways that we are watched that are very uncomfortable, where we might feel like we're under a magnifying glass, or where we might feel that we're being objectified, or where the watching might feel intrusive. But there are ways to watch that we feel held, that we feel supported, that we feel seen in our wholeness. And the part of the inner transformation of the teacher is learning how to move from being the watcher who is objectifying the children, who is seeing them through the lenses of our overall culture and our checklists and our need to get them to do something, or to get them to be something, or to get them to learn something, and shift that into a way of watching them that sees them as they really are, as their whole, beautiful, fantastic whole self. When we see them as their whole self, we give them permission to be their whole self. And that is an incredible gift. So when my mother sat with me and my sister and watched us watch the ants, that's what she was doing. And she learned how to do that partially because that's how she herself was brought up, because that's what her mother naturally did, but also through that incredible Montessori training. And those of you who have heard me talk about Nans training before know how different it was from anything that we've experienced today. Nans training was a full 2-year training where the entire first year was spent studying anthropology and psychology and dream interpretation and observation and all of these bigger, broader subjects that really were like, okay, this is the way the world works. And then in the second year, we can get into, this is what the child is. This is how the child works. And the amazing thing about Nan's observation practices is that they started with the environment. They always started with the environment, because we know as Montessorians that the environment is key, right? The environment shapes us. It affects our behaviors. So Nan's observations always started with the environment. And then they moved into what's happening in the environment. And then they moved into what's happening with this one thing that I am observing. And it was always a thing first. You know, we often joke about how many of us responded when my mother said, you have to observe a plant for 20 minutes now. And yet how much we learned from observing that plant. And we learned about the plant, but more importantly, we learned about ourselves and about what we had thought plants were and what surprised us about the plant. Because let me tell you, when you watch a plant for 20 minutes, you're going to find things that surprise you about that plant. So how do we watch in that way? How do we learn this? I'm going to switch gears for a second and talk about art. Yes, art. Because when you're learning life drawing, one of the first things that I learned was you have to draw not what you know is there and not what you think is there, but what you're actually seeing. Because if I'm going to try to draw this and I'm going to draw a circle on top and a circle on the bottom, that's not going to work so well. But if I'm going to look at this line here and examine the angle of that line and then examine the angle of this line and how it curves slightly, then I'm going to get a much more realistic drawing, right? And this is why Monet said that to see, we must forget the name of the thing that we are looking at. It's not really about the name of the thing, it's about what we think we know about that thing. Right? I know that my mug is 3-dimensional and I know that there's like a hole in the top, but am I really seeing that? And am I seeing that when I'm looking at it from every angle? And this is why Dr. Montessori also said, and this is in Education and Peace, when I am with children, I am nobody. I am nobody. And the greatest privilege I have when I approach them is being able to forget that I even exist. For this has enabled me to see things that one would miss if one were somebody. All of this speaks to the importance of letting go of what we think we know. Because if we're approaching children, people, objects with everything we think we know about them, are we really open to those elements of surprise? Are we open to that little gerbil there? Is that a gerbil or is that a rat over there? Um, Somebody's bringing us something exciting. Would we be open to seeing it? Do we think we know what's there? What are we really seeing? So do we really need to become nobody? Well, yeah, we actually do. We really do. Do we need to forget names? Yeah, we do. If we really want to see what's in front of us, we have to. We have to be able to put aside everything that we think we know about what it is that we are waiting for. Right? We're waiting. So this is where we come to the way that Montessori talks about rooting out our prejudices. Now, today, when we use the word prejudice, we tend to think about racial prejudice, right? Or gender prejudice, or prejudice against marginalized groups of people. But what Montessori was actually talking about is more along the lines of a preconceived notion, right? And that is what prejudice against other people is also, right? It's based in a preconceived notion of what somebody is, based on what we're judging them by. So in a very technical sense, it's the same thing. But when you look at the meaning of it, it's actually not. Because what Dr. Montessori is asking us to do is to think about what we think we know about children. What do we think we know about children that gets in the way of us being able to see the children? And that may well include all of those forms of identity and all of their belonging to all of the marginalized groups. But it may also be something as simple as that a child is not a miniature adult. It might be something as simple as that we grew up thinking that children manipulate adult emotions and that they do so on purpose, because that is a very common misconception. So how do we know that what we think we know about children is true? That's one of those questions that you got to sit with. That's one of those locked doors. How do we know what we know? How did we create the body of knowledge? It didn't come out of nowhere, right? It didn't just spring up in our heads. Oh, this is everything about children. How do we create bodies of knowledge? Well, we create them through socialization, right? We are socialized into a certain understanding. We buy into a certain set of beliefs when we become members of a society, when we grow into adulthood in a particular society. And we're taught a lot of things directly. And we learn a lot of things by absorbing them, right? So a lot of what we think we know about children is actually things that we absorbed when we were in our absorbent mind stage. And a lot of what we think we know about children is based on how we were treated when we were children. Because that is the message that our absorbent mind received about us as children. And so much of what we learned was just wrong. It was just wrong. So what do we do about that, right? That's why we have to become nobody. That's why we have to forget the names of things, because when we look at a child and we look at them through that lens of that body of knowledge that we have acquired through our entire lives, that is largely wrong. We're not going to get a clear perception of the actual child who is actually in our presence in that actual moment. It's also important to consider, what do we even consider knowledge to be? When I talk about knowledge, I'm going to go ahead and guess that most of you are thinking about pedagogical theory, and that you're thinking about cultural messaging, and that you're thinking about all the thinking that we do. But what is knowledge? Is knowledge just thinking? Is knowledge just fact? And do we need to know? What do we actually need to know? Observing while waiting is to be ready to really see that child when they reveal themselves. It means we're not poking and prodding for specific pieces of knowledge. And it means we're not looking through that lens of what we think we know. Now, I said I wasn't going to give you any tools, but what I am going to give you is this. What my mother was taught and what she taught me is that the way we create this capacity within ourselves is to find ways of observing ourselves while we observe other things at the same time. So there are tools that we use, and I mean, there's an observation course that's, a year long, which we're not going to do. But it's really about becoming aware of our responses to what is happening in our space. It's about becoming aware of our thoughts. It's becoming aware of the sensations inside our bodies. It's about becoming aware of the sensations that are reaching us from other places. And in that way, we can start to discern the difference between what is coming from within, and that includes our thoughts, and what is coming from out there. And then we start to see how the two are related and how we are completely enmeshed with our environment, and how that enmeshment includes the child. And when we can start to see that, that's when our transformation really takes root. Because that's when we start to understand that our thoughts are not the be all and end all. Our thoughts are not something that we can control. Our thoughts are not facts. And neither are our senses. And yet we can still know through them. And so that allows us to develop our capacity to see more clearly what is actually happening. That is what allows us to be there and fully present and open to that mystery, to that secret of the child when they are ready to reveal it to us. And with that, I'm going to leave you with the question, I don't remember how Barbara worded it in that beautiful email, but what are the assumptions? What are the obstacles in your observations? And in obstacles, I want you to consider your own assumptions as well. So what are the obstacles in your observations of children, and what can you learn from the obstacles themselves?
Andy, some real challenges for us to think about. Very important contributions to the way how we see observation, and additions to Montessori's writing. Thank you so very much. And here we go to our breakout rooms to discuss. me, this has been one of the most meaningful conversations we have had on Montessori Europe webinar since we have started. I hope you have had the same feelings, and I would like to invite Heidi van Staden to share with us the reflections on the room in which she is.
Thank you, Barbara. All right, so my 1 minute starts now. We had a lot of very interesting conversation. Right at the end, Robert gave us some homework and provoked us to think about the difference between perception and perceiving, which I thought was really quite nice, something we can take back to the drawing board for ourselves. We also spoke about possibly letting go of record keeping and tracking against, benchmarks and milestones, and spending that time rather in observation, because time was a big challenge. It was one of the big obstacles that our group found. And we spoke about the value of the observation as opposed to the value of the other thing we might be doing instead of observing, and maybe finding a balance between the value in observing and that other thing. I think also one of the other points was just the attitude that we have as the adults to the observation and what we're going into the observation for, and our intention. And do we share those observations with the rest of our staff? That was another burning question. So yeah, like Andy, I have more questions than answers, I think, but it was really, really a good conversation. Thank you, Barbara.
So much, Heidi. Suzanne, and Wendy, would you like to share?
Thanks, Barbara. I'm happy to start, and then Wendy, if you'll add when we're done. We also had a really, really interesting discussion in our room. A lot of we looked about how to do these observations from a practical perspective, being able to find the time to do that observation, and how one would need to engage with the other staff in the environment that would give one the space to be able to do this, especially in a classroom of bigger classroom. We also looked at how relationships with families can sometimes color what we see. So if we know, for example, we've had a previous experience with a family, when we're observing the child, we're almost looking with an expectation, and that expectation will lead to an assumption. There was also an interesting point that was raised about the anxiety of the teacher when doing an observation, because you're expected to see the children working. And when there is no work happening, the resulting anxiety within the teacher, which sometimes leads to questioning of one's own ability. We also had some discussions around autistic children with differing needs, and obviously having some prejudice because you're needing to compare them to the body of knowledge that you have been exposed to, but also in the realizations that because that body of knowledge gives rise to assumptions, that we miss a lot because we're more focused on the assumption rather than what we're seeing, and we try to jump to conclusions too fast. And then we ended off by having quite an interesting and varied discussion, Andy, thanks very much, on what it means to be a nobody. So I think all of us are left with the challenge of what does it mean to be a nobody, and how do we get there, and do we completely detach from ourselves, or does being a nobody mean we're still a somebody but with a nobody persona? So Wendy, I don't know if you want to add further.
Well, there's just a couple of things I think that people said, which I've written down because I thought I need to think about this. Being a nobody requires lots of trust, and I do think that is actually quite right. And somebody else compared it to the beginner's mind from Buddhism. And so coming back to meditating and mindfulness, I think that's an area as well that maybe we need to think about. But you covered everything else, Suzanne. Thank you very much. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Suzanne and Wendy. Sarah and Marion, would you like to share?
Sarah's going to take the lead on this and start us off, I think.
Suzanne, you've raised a lot of points that many of the people in our group talked about. The obstacles of seeing something and immediately making connections, and that leading you down a path, and so taking you away from what you're really watching at this time. Something that was said that was noteworthy or interesting was being aware that this could be my perception. So just the fact that you now start to be aware that this could be my perception means that you're in the process of moving forward, and that it needs to be baby steps. And this idea about grace and patience and care of oneself, that it takes time to develop these skills. They're not going to be there in an instant, and that they may be better on one day than another, and that we need to move forward with this grace and care. And the idea that at the bottom of it, all we need to do is to be there to know the children that are there in front of us, and that all of the other things are potential challenges that get in the way. All we really need to do is to be there. So we need time and we need practice, and that slowly we will get to this place. Marion, anything else?
I think the only thing I wanted to add was Vanina's comment regarding reminding us about Montessori and where she started with this kind of scientific way and methodology of looking exactly at an observation in a scientific way, looking at the facts, looking at actually what happened, rather than allowing everything else to come in and fog or muddle the mind, really, to be able to. And we did all think that we would like to chant and do yoga in the morning to get us to that space, but you know, yeah, I agree. Sarah covered most of it very eloquently.
Thank you so much. We have had, as I said at the beginning of this session, most phenomenal discussion about what observation means really to us as individuals, and how it reflects on us, as well as how we interpret the children's learning. Couple of things that I valued was, of course, the obstacle being our own agenda. And in a way, the progress means a journey of self-healing. So through observing children, we may find a way of understanding ourselves a little bit more and a little bit better. I really loved the idea of the observer being the holder of the space for the child. Because if you think about it in that context, it suddenly gives us a very different role. It is no longer passive. It is very a dynamic act of observation by protecting the child's right to be who they are. And of course, our biggest gift has come from Antonella at the end, when she reminded us that the eye of the observer needs to be benevolent. And I think that that really expresses fully the gift that the adult gets from being a benevolent observer. You suddenly feel the child that you are observing. in a very, very different way. So it's the emotional element of observation which contributes significantly to the spiritual preparation of the teacher. But at that point, I will hand over to Andy.
Thank you, Barbara. I was so happy in each of the rooms that I visited to hear the depth of your conversations. And I think what you, each of the facilitators has brought back to this space is very indicative of that depth, and summed up what I was hearing everywhere. So I'm going to keep this really short because I really only have this to say. A lot of what comes up as obstacles most of the time is things like time and space, and how am I going to make this work with the other adults in the room? And yet what I heard so many of you saying is that there's something else underneath all of that. And that comes back to this whole idea of trust. And so what I invite you to consider is really what is under all of that. Why is it so hard for us to observe? Where is that? What is that anxiety that you talked about? What is that fear? And I'm going to invite you to think about that as a fear of uncertainty and a fear of what might actually come up within ourselves. Because this is, and Rob, it's really great to see you here today, Rob. I am so excited to see you. Hi, Rob. One of the things that Rob and I often talk about is why it's so hard for people to sit. Why is it so hard for us to be still? And I want you to think about that and why. Why is it so hard for us to just stop? And so much of that is what you were all saying in these rooms, is that it's our own stuff that's coming up. It's our own experiences, our own beliefs, our own anxieties, our own fears, our own feelings of inadequacy. And that's the real obstacle. Observing that is what actually creates this transformation. And I think it was Melis who said that it's actually an act of self-healing. And it really is. The spiritual transformation of the teacher is a healing process for us. If we are willing and able to engage with it. And it's not something we can do on our own. It has to be in relationship, whether it's in relationship to other people or relationship to our environments, our relationship to children, our relationship to our own past. It's an act of self-healing that happens in relationship. And so I'm going to leave you with that and with that question to keep on thinking about, why is it so hard? And I thank you all so much for engaging so intensely and so beautifully with these big, giant questions. And I invite you to live into the questions. And I thank you very, very much.
We thank you, Andy, for sharing your wisdom and expressing it so beautifully to make it accessible to any of us on our own journey of knowing ourselves and knowing the children that we work with. I wonder if we could invite you to come back in a year's time. And if I could invite you who have participated today to see what discoveries you have made about observation, about yourselves, and also about the children with whom you work. I hope that you will be able to make this date in 2022. Please look out for the messages from Montessori Europe This has been an exceptional session which opened many new doors for understanding what Montessori really means by the spiritual development of the teacher, which she herself may not have been able to express fully, but it falls to us to make it work for the children of today and tomorrow. I would like to remind you that in the beginning of May, we will return to the work of Piaget and his ideas about schemas and schemes and how we can observe them in children's work. And of course, there is Montessori Europe Congress at the end of May, which we are proud to be present to you free of charge for all of you to be able to share in issues which relate to the environment and to sustainability of the planet. So please join us, continue to support us. And if you are not a member, it would be so great if you would join us. Thank you very much indeed. And once again, thank you, Andy.